will get away with. He will imprison. He will execute whoever he's allowed to imprison, execute, drive from the country. Just look at his past. It's not really hard.
Oh, Joe, honey, you got to go get some help for that TDS, because the left, they equate nationalism to fascism and Nazism. Hence, they believe Trump is Hitler. The Morning Joe started by focusing on comparing Trump's politics to fascism. And Scarborough, he went from 0 to 100 real quick. Okay. He goes on and then he says, and you heard it there, he's running to end American democracy as we know it. And then he goes even further and he says, just because Trump hasn't done it yet it doesn't mean he won't do it when he gets a chance to do it. And then his evidence here of saying Trump is going to execute all of these people, he's going to drive them away from the country, he's going to incarcerate them. His evidence here is, quote, he might do it because he hasn't done it yet, but he could do it. Makes sense, doesn't it? And of course, Scarborough, he predicted that Trump would do this to all of his political opponents if he had his way. He'd imprison them. He'd imprison whoever he's allowed to imprison, and then he'd execute people, and then he'd drive people away from the country. And then he says, just look at his past. It's really not that hard to read. Again, the only thing that stood between him and the destruction of American democracy was this federal judiciary. The lack of self-awareness is extremely infuriating. There was one correct thing he did talk about here in this clip. He says that there's a reason why we have separation of powers. Our system was intended to be set up that way to prevent a dictator from taking over. That said, this sort of perpetual outrage and unhinged fear-mongering is the last thing journalists should be doing if they intend to attract moderate voters. This is outrageous. To sit there and say that Trump is going to execute people is absurd. And the closest thing we've ever had to a dictator is actually Joe Biden, because he's actually imprisoned and executed political dissidents. Okay, look at Matthew Perna. Okay, now he didn't hang him publicly, but Matthew Perna believed that he was going to probably be hung publicly or be imprisoned for a lifetime, and he wound up killing himself. Joe Biden and the federal government here, whoever is in charge of jailing these J6ers, they have blood on their hands. The prosecutor has blood on his hands. Matthew Perna, he's just one of them. There are several J6ers who are imprisoned because they are political dissenters. They don't agree with Joe Biden. They didn't agree with the election, and they were jailed. So that's the closest thing we've got to a dictator so far here in America. I'm back next. It's Cities 92.9.